Thank you very much. For me, it's a genuine pleasure to be here today. I think everybody in the room, or at least everybody in the room, has an interest in poverty, and I don't know why you would be here if you didn't, has an intellectual debt to Eric, and we all recognize that. I also have a substantial professional debt to Eric. For the last 20 years, my office has been down the hall, across the hall, around the corner from Eric's. And in that time, I've been able to see and understand better than most really what a scholar Eric is. A scholar in the proper sense of that. He's curious, he's engaged, he asks a lot of questions, and he also works incredibly hard. In all those years, just the fact that I knew that Eric would be in the office early in the morning, every day, day after day, on weekends, got me to the office early in the morning, every day, not on weekends. But I didn't realize I was tethered to this thing.
No, you can put it in your pocket.
Okay, I'll try to do that. Thanks. And then I'm going to trip on it. And by a rough calculation, just the pressure of knowing that Eric was going to be in there, I figure is responsible for about half of the academic output I've done in my career. And this paper is no exception. Jackie sent us an email saying we're going to have a conference. It's in Eric's honor. And the pressure was, we got to come up with a paper. Eric merits that. He deserves it. We have to give this a good shot. And of course, faced with that pressure, I did what any good academic will do. I got a co-author. That's David. He's here. He's modestly jet lagged, so if he dozes off, it doesn't mean that he's not interested. But we've started a paper. This is certainly not finished. And if you came here wanting to learn something about Africa, something interesting about Africa, I'm going to apologize up front because there's not that much yet that's interesting about Africa here. But I think it has potential. Mostly it's a methods paper now with some examples, but we're working hard on it. And soon I think we will have more interesting things to say about Africa. So the motivation for this paper, basically everyone knows and everyone's talking about the fact that growth has picked up in Africa. That's great. We're happy about that. But we're also economists and by nature dismal. And so we immediately begin to complain or at least be concerned about the fact that, well, maybe the distribution of that growth is not as widespread as we would like. And we should be concerned about that. And there is now a very large literature on pro-poor growth and inclusive growth and trying to understand who is getting the benefits of this. But that literature is largely concentrated on one fruit, and that fruit is income or expenditure. We want to look at different fruits, and in particular, we're going to look at children's health, which is why they put us in this session, I think. This is some aspect of multidimensional poverty. So, as I'll show you here, child health is improving in Africa recently, just like income is improving, and that's a good thing. I've got a column of data here with infant mortality rates there. You can see there's pretty consistent decline in infant mortalities, but if you look at the gradient, the first derivative, you'll see that it was faster from the 70s to the 80s, slowed down, and again has accelerated again now from the 90s or to the aughties or whatever we call that one. And you can also see that there's some decline in the share of countries that were showing declines in infant mortality, and that picked up again. For anthropometric measures, which are the stunting in particular is a pretty good measure of a child's health history, we can see that things actually got worse from the 80s to the 90s, but now have improved again, and certainly the number of countries showing improvement from the 80s to the 90s increased. So there is a story here. Just like income is improving in Africa, and we should be happy about that, kids' health is improving in Africa, and we should be happy about that as well. But we can also start to wonder, what's the distribution? What are the distributional consequences of that, and how should we understand those things? So we know, and we've known for a long time, there's a static correlation between income and health, and we know we can see this at individual level data, and we can see it cross-country data, the Preston curves. We also know from the work of Adam Wagstaff and his colleagues at the World Bank that the incidence of health across the income distribution, that health is worse at the lower end of the income distribution in developing countries and better at the higher end. So we know those things. As far as we can tell, we don't know anything about how these health improvements that we're seeing on average, we don't know anything about how those health improvements are distributed across the population. And that's one of the things that this paper hopes to address. We're going to look in particular at how those health improvements are distributed across the income distribution. And we're also going to look at how they're distributed across the health distribution. And then, just to be cheeky, we're going to look at how income improvements are distributed across the health distribution. If this is a session on multidimensional poverty, if we're going to take that seriously, we have to believe that the distribution of health is important, just as the distribution of income is important. And we should be curious, we should be concerned about the well-being of people who are unhealthy and how that well-being changes over time, just like we're concerned about how the well-being of people who are income poor is changing over time, as measured by their health or their incomes. Okay, so those are our three goals here. Okay, now we're going to propose a new way to measure this. I have to admit to James that this is going to have to go into a dashboard. This is not the be-all and end-all of measurement of health improvements in Africa, but I do think it gives a useful analysis, and we'll learn something from it. So the thing that we're going to rip off is the growth incidence curve. This is something due to Martin Ravalian and Chen. Developed 15 years ago, or maybe even a little more than that. And it's a pretty simple curve. Here on the horizontal axis, we have people ordered by their percentile of the household expenditure distribution. Okay, so the poorest percentile is over here, the richest percentile is over there. And on the vertical axis, we have the growth rate of people in that percentile. Okay, so this is just the difference of a log of expenditures per capita as a measure of the growth rate. And so you can see this one is for Uganda. And you can see that between 1988 and 2011, Uganda first, there's been a significant amount of growth. And because these are each percentiles, your eye can actually do the averaging if you really want to know the average, because each point on the graph has equal weight. But you can see on average something like 45% growth in household expenditures per capita over this time in Uganda. But you can also see where that growth has been stronger, over at the high end of the income distribution. And that's the usefulness of this particular graph. It gives us a sense not just on average how much incomes are going up, but where are they going up in the distribution of household expenditures themselves. Okay? Whether this constitutes pro-poor growth, there's an argument about that. Some people are absolutists, saying poor people's incomes have gone up, that's pro-poor. Other people are relativists, saying no, richer people's incomes went up more than poor people, so that's not pro-poor. We don't really have to take a position on that for this particular paper, but we will see it may matter in the interpretation of what we have. Okay, now, Ravalian and Chen already did that, so we can't. But we're going to modify this in very straightforward ways. The strict analogy, if you're interested in health and how the distributions of improvements in health or what that looks like, would be just to do exactly the same curve, but use a health measure. For example, how tall are kids? Okay, and so we could calculate that health measure. The P there would be your percentile in the distribution of heights. And we can calculate the change in the heights at each pth percentile, graph a similar thing, and give you, well, we'll see, I don't have a name for it yet, but give you something like that. We're actually going to do something slightly different. Rather than look at the percentage change up there at the top as they do for the growth incidence curves, we're going to look at the absolute changes, but it's the same basic idea. So our health improvement then is going to be measured in absolute terms in centimeters, and we'll see on the vertical axis how to interpret that. Okay? That would be consistent with what some people call a univariate approach to the distributional analysis of health, and there's a long literature on this as well. But there's also a gradient approach, and that looks at how the distribution of health, not across the health distribution, but across the income distribution. And we want to do the same thing, but looking at health improvements and asking, where are those health improvements happening across the income distribution? So to do that, we're going to have to run a regression, because we need to know what's the expected value of a child's height, for example, conditional on him or her being in the pth percentile. That's a simple thing to do these days. So we will do that, and we'll get, now this P would be your percentile in the income distribution, or the expenditure distribution. And this would be the height that's associated with income at that pth percentile. Okay, and we'll look at the difference of those as well. Okay, David more strongly than me, but both of us are fond of the univariate approach when we do distributional analysis of health. But I do have to admit, there's one advantage of this gradient method that we can't use, and that is we'll be able to analyze discrete health indicators like infant mortality, whether a child dies or not before his or her first birthday. We're able to do that because we just need to estimate that conditional expectation across the income distribution, and you can do that with a discrete variable, but you can't generate a pth percentile of the infant mortality because it's a 0 or a 1. Okay, so this method doesn't have a name yet, and we'll come to that. But this is one example of what it looks like. This would be the univariate approach. So here I've got the percentage of the standardized heights of kids, how tall they are relative to a benchmark of healthy kids around the world. And this would be the change, again, between 1988 and 2011 in Uganda. So, and you can see that on average, children in Uganda are almost 2 centimeters taller in 2011 than they were in 1988. So that is real progress. You can also see the distribution of that progress, which is pretty equitable. That is, it doesn't really matter, with the possible exception of this, and these are estimated non-parametrically, and I worry about the boundary thing here, but if you took this seriously, you would be concerned about this, because it says the very, very shortest children are also showing the least gains, and that might be some concern. But for the vast majority of the distribution, you see this is pretty flat. Things are going rather equitably. And here's an example of using the gradient. Here I've got the predicted household expenditures per capita on the horizontal axis, and here's a health indicator on the vertical axis, the difference in survival probability for children up to their first birthday. And again, it's Uganda. And again, we can see that survival probabilities are increasing. This is 2% or 20 per thousand, the typical way we cite infant mortality rates. So somewhere around 3 to 3.5% increase in survival probabilities for infants in Uganda over this time. And we can see that the confidence interval, this is very wide, that comes with a discrete indicator. But we can see it does look like those gains are actually coming for those with the lowest expenditures per capita in Uganda over this period. And distributionally speaking, most of us would be happier about that than a curve that had the same mean and had an upward slope. All right, now, this is your chance to get an easy publication. You can name that curve. We don't have a name for it yet. We desperately need a name for it. Obviously, if we're going to have any success with this at all, it's got to have a good name and a good acronym. Okay? I'd be particularly happy if Eric, not to put pressure on him, but I should because he deserves it. I'd be particularly happy if Eric came up with his name because then his name would go in this paper and it would increase its credibility significantly. We've already looked at several and decided we can't do these. All right, growth incidence curve, Ravalian and Chen beat us to that. I think we kind of have an a priori claim to this when we're looking at kids' heights because that is growth. But we're not going to sell that. All right, health incidence curve, that doesn't work. Both a lousy acronym, HIC, and also that's really more what Wagstaff and his colleagues do, looking at the incidence of health across some welfare distribution. All right, whereas what we're looking at is changes in that. All right, so health improvement curve, no, still lousy acronym. All these others have lousy acronyms all the way down, although I'm particularly fond of this one. I couldn't sell it to my co-author. All right, we're desperate and we're evidently incompetent. If you would like to be a co-author on this paper, and I will allow you to see all the results, as well as the skeletons in the closet before you sign up, come up with a name for these curves. There's actually 3 of them so far. Right, we have the ones where we're looking at health improvements across the income distributions. We have the ones where we're looking at health improvements across the health distribution. And we're going to look at income improvements across the health distribution. So there's 3 opportunities. I don't think I want to take on 3 co-authors. It'll start to look like a physics paper. All right. So very quickly, the data come from the Demographic and Health Survey. Actually, I will, not so quickly. I'm going to make an aside here because James made the case for more and better data. And I think the Demographic and Health Surveys are just a fabulous example of data driving interesting stuff. Some very clever demographer, I don't know who it was, but some very clever demographer convinced USAID years and years ago to fund these demographic and health surveys. And there are now many of them. They're mostly well done. They're consistent across time and across countries. And they've produced thousands and thousands of papers, and not least of which are the MPI papers, based on someone convincing someone with money that having this information would be productive. And I think it's just absolutely undeniable that it has been productive for us and for you and for many, many other scholars. So we're going to use DHS data. And in particular, our health indicators are going to be how tall children are and also whether they survive to their first birthday, infant mortality, right? Our expenditure, our income welfare variable is going to be their expenditures per capita, except that those aren't in the DHS. And so we do a little exercise where we find comparable income and expenditure surveys with some indicator variables that are both in those surveys and in the DHS, like characteristics of the house, education of the adults in the house, and some basic assets that households own. And in the income expenditure survey, we regress the expenditures on those indicators, and then we can use the resulting coefficients to predict people's expenditures or expenditures per capita for the households in the DHS survey. And that's how we go about doing this. It is true that our sample is for kids. It's not for households. So these particular results pertain to kids because that's our main interest here is child health. Okay. To date, we've only done this in 3 countries. We have a list that we're trying to process, but we've only done this for 3 countries. The results, as a result of that, have to be very tentative, and I'm not going to sell these. I did pass out a sheet of paper because I think it's helpful to look at these kind of both across that sheet of paper and also down the sheet of paper. So if you look across the sheet of paper, you can see the various curves, none of which has a name yet, but you can see the various curves and how they look different in different countries. And if you look down the sheet of paper, you can see how those curves differ within a country. So how we're getting a different sense of how welfare is improving in that particular country. Okay? You can look at those. I can't because I lost the sheet of paper. You can look at these, and we have looked at these. We haven't drawn very many generalizations, and I don't think it's really the time to draw generalizations. But there are two so far that I'm going to pitch. One is there don't seem to be clear patterns looking across countries. As you look at different countries, these themes, they seem to be different. Both if you look straight across the graphs and look at the same graph for the different countries, you'll see the experiences differ. But also if you kind of look catty corner across the graphs, you'll see that the way these things seem to go together in the different countries are different. And right now, I'm just going to take that as a justification for each and every country doing their own analysis. That is, they're not going to be able to look at Uganda and say, oh yeah, that's what happened in Uganda. We expect that's what should have happened in our country as well. It's worth doing this, but you better move fast because we're trying to do it for as many as we can, and we'll add those in. The second thing that I think is more important and in a lot of ways is encouraging is that if you look at the health results, and I can't put them up there, but if you look at the health results, they look distributionally happier than the income results. In particular, we can see that those of us who know and work in Uganda know that growth has been very solid for a long time in Uganda. And that's encouraging. But we also know that inequality is increasing in Uganda. That is, the income growth has been the highest at the high end of the income distribution. And while I wouldn't want to begrudge those people their income growth, most of us would be happier if that were flatter. But then if we go down and look at the health improvements in Uganda, they are better. They may even have a negative gradient there, which says that we're seeing the most health improvement, at least for kids, at the lower end of the expenditure distribution in Uganda. And I find that more positive and something to feel good about in terms of how this is developing in Africa. Okay. And then the last thing I'll say, which is just a bald promotion of this approach, is that the way the expenditure distribution looks is not at all the way the health distributions look. These things come out differently. So that again, if you are in Uganda and you're saying, well, we have, at least in relative terms, not a pro-rich distribution of the improvements in income, you can't at all conclude from that the health distributions will be the same. That seems to be not the case in Uganda. And so this also justifies looking at more than just incomes and how incomes are changing or improving across any measure of welfare that you like. And with that, I'll conclude. Thank you very much.